Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, the Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, an exciting and extending group of shows, including the Bleacher Bunch, Sunranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, Baseball Rabbit Hole, and Bricks Behind the Ivy. Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and CubsPS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, where you can support the show and always find a variety of benefits starting as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. The spin on the baseball metric, OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you can share this episode with a friend. It's January 30th, and the Cubs are still mentioned with a variety of players, including Alex Bregman and Dylan Cease. It's also my birthday. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 101. No Cubs players ever won 3 digits, so I'm going to have to change this opening game up a little bit. Sometimes I'll go back to uniform numbers. Sometimes I'll use a stat. This episode will be the 2024 Cubs offense episode of this podcast, since the team posted a 101 WRC plus last year. Which leads me into what I want to talk about. Last year's team was good. The year before was good. Arguably, maybe overachieved in 2023. Probably arguably underachieved in 2024. Some of that was injury related, but not all of it. And that 101 WRC plus put them in a 3-way tie for 13th place in Major League Baseball last year. As you'd expect. The WRC plus is designed to be 100 be league average. So 101, you're basically a league average offense. And you're right there with Toronto and Oakland at 13, 14, 15. Trailing, not every team above them made the playoffs. Somehow Seattle, who seems to always have offensive issues, wound up with a better WRC plus. They were at 104 in 12th place. But the majority of the teams ahead of them made the playoffs. Not surprisingly, right? I mean, the game is to score runs. Score more runs than your opponent does. So if you are an above average offense, take some of the pressure off your pitching. It's going to help you win ball games. I think the Cubs came into the season solid-ish everywhere. Not necessarily every position, but they're going to be no worse than probably average-ish offensively. Solid starting pitching. They finished the year with a pretty good bullpen, so there are going to be regressions and progressions. So some guys are going to be better. Some guys are going to be worse. Probably average-ish bullpen. That's where they were heading into the offseason. They've made a bunch of moves, and every time they make a move, there's a real urge to, what does this mean for them now? Where are they? I try to be careful with that, especially in process. Like I could say December 1st, that this team is still missing A, B, C, D, whatever. The offseason's not over. We're getting close to the offseason. It's not over yet. And this offseason might be one of those that lingers into spring training. We saw a couple guys sign. Cody Bellinger signed with the Cubs right before spring training last year. Other guys famously, like Blake Snell, Jordan Montgomery, went into spring training. And this year it's looking like Alex Bregman, Pete Alonso, Jack Flaherty still haven't signed. There are a ton of relievers out there. There are also a lot of lower tier players. Jorge Polanco is one that's out there. Jose Iglesias had a really good run with the Mets last year. Mark Canha is a guy who might be able to help the Cubs as a first base backup, depth outfielder, depending on where the Cubs want to go with their roster. But the Cubs have made a lot of moves, and some of the moves, looking just in isolation, are a little head scratching. Some of them make great sense. Kyle Tucker. But every time one of those happens, okay, that's great. Now what? What's next? And that's still where we are with this offseason, although I think the picture is becoming a little bit more clear. When you look at this team now, as currently constituted, let's talk payroll up front. I talked about this a little bit last week, but now since my last episode, they have finalized John Birdie and they have traded for Ryan Presley from the Astros. So Ryan Presley came over with a $14 million annual salary for this season. It's a 1-year rental, just like Tucker. But they got the Astros to kick in $5.5 million, so the Cubs are going to be paying $8.5 million for Ryan Presley. $2 million for John Birdie to be infield utility depth. So the Cubs are currently sitting right around $207 million in payroll, which aligns with stats I'm keeping here, but that's from Roster Resource on Fangraphs. SpotTrack has numbers that are still trailing. I'm not sure. I need to sit down one of these days and look player by player and see what the differences are. I found over the last year that Roster Resource typically gets to the real answer faster than SpotTrack does. SpotTrack is still reliable, but right now SpotTrack is showing the Cubs with a significantly lower, by $15 or $20 million, lighter payroll than I think they're actually carrying, which is why I'm using Roster Resource. But the Cubs, not even going to get back into the whole breaking even thing, but the Cubs are probably aiming for that luxury tax threshold as kind of the, not necessarily a hard cap, but they've gone over it. They went over it last year. I've talked on my show a lot about the Cubs going over that threshold several times in the late 2010s. From 2016 to 2020, they were over, I think, 4 of the 5 years. They were a top 5 payroll in baseball 3 times. They were the second highest payroll in 2019. I think they were third in 2019, second in 2020. Hard to know how 2020 would have ended. That was the year before the sell-off. I don't know if 2020 had been a full season. My guess is the Cubs would have competed. They would have been pretty good. They might have added more to the deadline even from where they were, or they might have helped. But obviously with 2020 season being what it was, very strange. They were technically over the CBT, but no teams had to pay luxury tax that year just because of all the weird, wonky short season, no fans in the stands, revenues were completely wonky, so that just got waived. But they still went, the team was in spring training before the world shut down, and the Cubs went into spring training as one of the highest payrolls in baseball. So that part of it is legitimate. But what are they going to do? So I would expect them to leave $10 to $15 million for in-season acquisitions. So that would put them probably around $225 to $230. I think they'll at least get up over $220 million. So I don't think they're done yet. But let's walk through what they have done. So the starting rotation on paper right now, they have added Matthew Boyd, they've added Colin Ray. And so whatever order you want to stack them up, however they come out of spring training, you're looking at Justin Steele, Shota Imanaga, Jamison Tyone, Matthew Boyd, and probably Colin Ray as the 5th starter. There's also a lot of depth. You could have Javier Assad could be in the starting rotation. Jordan Wicks could compete for a starting rotation spot. Cody Poteet could start. Caleb Killian could start. They're going to have Nate Pearson presumably go to Iowa, but they're going to try to stretch him out and see if he can get back to being a starting pitcher. Ben Brown could potentially start. They've still got guys who are not on the 40-man who could start. Brandon Birdsell is not far away. Cade Horton, if he's healthy, is not far away. So they have a lot of options. And there's still talk about the Cubs still trying to do more. I think the Cubs are definitely... It's hard to say the Cubs are definitely in this year because they've made some decisions on free agents and other spending choices that leave you scratching your head if the team is seriously in. But this team they are trying to improve. And so that's where I get into is it Jed? Is it Tom? It's a little bit of both, and I never quite know which one is which. Overall budget is certainly going to be set by Tom. But within that, it's hard to know, is Jed being careful because he doesn't want money pulled back on him at some point in the future if something happens? Is he just so naturally averse to these long deals that he wants to find value in every single thing and therefore is going to stay away from some of these guys? I don't know. But there's been a lot of chatter this week about the Cubs still being in the starting pitcher market, most notably a lot of trade chatter with San Diego. Now, San Diego, Peter Seidler passed away last year, their owner, or the head of their ownership group. He was the public face of the team. He was the one that was pushing all the chips in. The last 2, 3, 4 off seasons, the Padres had been very aggressive. A lot of spent big contracts, bringing in lots of big names. Xander Bogaerts for almost $300 million. I mean, guy after guy, Machado. They extended Fernando Tatis Jr. Traded for Yu Darvish. They traded for Dylan Cease. They had Juan Soto, who they had traded for. Then they flipped him to the Yankees, got Michael King. But now that Peter's passed, there's some clear dispute among the ownership group. I guess his brothers have taken charge of the team, but his widow his wife is suing to have more of a role with the team. So that's very much in the flux, and they really have not done much this offseason. I think it's pretty clear they're trying to pull back some of the payroll a little bit. And they've got some expiring contracts, notably among those I mentioned, Dylan Cease, former Cub, and Michael King, who came over from the Yankees in the Juan Soto deal. They have both had a lot of attention and chatter around potential trades to the Cubs. Now, both guys would be relatively expensive. I'm going to guess, based on what I've read, the asking price for Dylan Cease seems to be way high. I saw a report from Jacob Zanola today. I don't know his sourcing, but he's had some success recently. So his report was that the starting negotiation point, now starting doesn't mean that's ultimately the price that they would have to pay, but the starting price for Dylan Cease is Matt Shaw plus more. And that's just, Dylan Cease is really good, but for 1 year of Dylan Cease, that is not at all worth it in my book whatsoever. Like, I'm not even having that discussion. Michael King, I saw, and it's hard to know how many of these are independently verified reports and how many are just recycled, but it feels like the Michael King situation is still going to be expensive. Would probably cost like Javier Assad. There seems to be reports out there that San Diego really likes Assad, and he'd be a good fit for San Diego. Plus outfield prospects are probably either Owen Casey or Kevin Alcantara. And then a third prospect, somebody probably lower in the system, maybe a top 30 prospect in the back half of the top 30 for the Cubs. Something lesser down the road lottery ticket, maybe a guy in A-ball. And that makes some sense, and that's what I would think about. Michael King last year, the way he finished the year, if he pitches like that, he's top 10, 15 pitcher in baseball. Potential legit ace. Heading into his 29 season, I believe, age 29. So he'd be a guy the Cubs might even want to have. He has a good year. They might want to look to extend it. We get into, again, are the Cubs going to pay these things? And then the other thing that comes in with some of those trade ideas is Jed clearly seems more open to trade than signing a free agent. There's less commitment. But one thing you do wind up doing is you wind up giving up years of control on young players for potentially 1 year of a really good player. So the Cubs gave up, I think it's something like 13 years of team control in the Astros deal for Kyle Tucker, because Hayden Wesneski has 2 left. Itzhak Paredes has 2 left. 2 left, possibly 3, but I think 2. And then Cam Smith has not come up yet, so he's got full 6. I think it's 10, 11, 12 years of team control for those 3 players in exchange for Kyle Tucker. And if you put together a trade package like that for Michael King, you're then giving up Javier Assad, who has 2 years left, or actually he is not even in ARB yet. So I think he's arbitration eligible next year. So that would give him 3 more years of team control. Alcantara and Casey would full 6. And then whatever the other would be another full 6, although it would be somebody who's years away from the major leagues. So you're potentially paying a lot of future price for the now, which is fine if it works out. It's fine if you build this team good enough. And that's where some of the philosophical differences between the way I would build the team and the way Jed builds the team come into play. I think those kinds of trades they have their place. The Cubs gave away a lot when they traded for Aroldis Chapman, but they had one goal in mind. It was to win the World Series that year. I think they were pretty sure they were not going to be keeping Aroldis Chapman. They were just all in on getting that ring at that moment, at that time. And I would imagine every single Cub fan would probably do that trade all over again 100 times. But this year, they're kind of almost going for it. They made the trade for Kyle Tucker. That's a big move. Kyle Tucker is a very good baseball player. He is a top 10, 15 offensive player in baseball. He's a guy that's going to anchor this lineup, going to make everybody around him better offensively. But it's only for a year. So again, if the plan really is, and we'll see, I say all the time that we'll see what they do. The Cubs have a history lately of not giving out that big contract. In the past, under prior ownership or even under prior leadership in the front office, at the time of the deals, John Lester was a top pitcher on the market. Max Scherzer was probably the biggest name on the market that year because he was younger and got a longer deal for more money. But John Lester was a legitimate star. Jason Hayward was the best offensive player on the market that year, regardless of how the contract played out, how it aged. That offseason, he was one of the top offensive gets, and he got one of the bigger contracts. They gave Yu Darvish a very competitive contract. So the Cubs have done it under Tom Ricketts, which is why I poo-poo the idea that under Tom, they will never. But they have not since COVID, so maybe some of the rules have changed. And they have not under Jed. The biggest deal Jed has given out is 7 years, 177. Which is probably, if you look at those past deals, the 100 and what was, John Lester was 160-ish, something like that. Jason Hayward was 8 years, 185, still the biggest contract the Cubs have ever given. You put those in today's dollars, and Jason Hayward's over $200 million, and John Lester's probably pushing it. Still certainly not to the Shohei Ohtani, Juan Soto levels, not even to like Mike Trout, that kind of thing. But the Cubs have done it in the past. Back in the day, prior ownership, Alfonso Soriano was the biggest gets out there. The Cubs have done it at times. Right now, the narrative is Tom is cheap. We hear it from national beat writers. We hear it from the fans. We hear it from 6-year-olds who have their kid go up and tell Tom Ricketts he's cheap when he's signing a bat. Because nobody needs my take on that. I think it's stupid. I think it's fine to have that confrontation, that discussion with the owner, but do it yourself. Don't put your 6-year-old up to it. That's ridiculous. But he's got that reputation and he's earned it. Reputation precedes. And it's also something he can change very quickly. Very, very quickly. All he has to do to fix that is give out a big contract. If the whole discussion is Jed will never, Tom will never, go offer Kyle Tucker 12 years, $400 million. You sign him to that, the will never is gone. Still, maybe he won't do it as often as fans would want, as often as I would want. But that's a very easy narrative for Tom to change. He just has to make the change. So we'll watch that. That's something. But if the Cubs are going to extend Kyle Tucker, if they do break with recent history and they do give him that big extension and he agrees to it, or he may actually hit free agency, but if they sign him long term, one way or the other, that's a big change. Then at that point, it's really worth having given up what they gave up in order to get him to, number one, be better in 2025 and have a chance to compete for the postseason. And then also to have that year. The Cubs now have, they're almost 2 months into about an 11-month window of exclusive negotiation time with Kyle Tucker. They have time to bring him on board. They have time for him to get to know the team, get to know the front office, get to know ownership. In spring training, he'll start to play, start to bond with his teammates, hopefully. Get to Wrigley Field. If he has a good season and the Cubs are good, it's going to be a magical season in Wrigley Field, and that's going to be something that's probably pretty easy to fall in love with. I say all that not to expect that, he's going to fall so in love with Chicago, the Cubs are going to get this massive discount. They're not. They're going to have to pay market rate. You got to pay full freight on a player like Kyle Tucker. But they have this year to convince him that, hey, Chicago's a pretty cool place to be in the summer. And if you're here, we're going to have good baseball teams, and the Wrigley faithful are incredible to play in front of. There's a ton of energy every day. And maybe this is a place where you want to stay. And then when this season is over, however it goes for the Cubs, free agency begins after the World Series ends, but free agents can only negotiate with their own team for the first 5 days. So again, there's windows of exclusivity here that the Cubs benefit from, and they paid a price for. Same would be true if the Cubs were to trade for Dylan Cease or Michael King. If they wanted to extend either one or both, they've got the year here to sell them on being a Cub. But this team is being built kind of brick by brick. So where I would differ with what Jed has done is if you're going to go trade for Kyle Tucker and you don't know for sure that you're going to have him beyond this year, it's a big investment made in that trade. I only have him for 1 year, guaranteed. And he's a really, really good baseball player. So I like the fact that they're churning a lot of the roster. This roster is better than it was when the 2024 season ended. I don't think there's any question about that. I think the offense is better. I think the rotation is better. I think the bullpen is better. I think the offense maybe not as well. They're effectively as deep because effectively the Cubs had no bench last year. I'm not sure the Cubs have really significantly deepened the offense overall. They've deepened the lineup by putting in Kyle Tucker as an upgrade over Cody Bellinger. But I'm not sure the offense is significantly upgraded yet. But on the pitching side, depth is a complete 180 from where they started the season last year. And I'll get into that in a minute because one thing I really want to talk about today is building a bullpen and what that means. But if I've got Kyle Tucker for 1 year, I want to go big. I want to win that. Now, again, going big, nobody's going as big as the Dodgers. The Mets are pushing it, but even the Mets are way behind the Dodgers. I mean, the Dodgers just seems like every day they sign 3 new guys are going to go. They're at a point now where to clear roster spots for the guys they have signed, they're almost to the point where they have to trade really talented young pitching like Dustin May, Bobby Miller in order to make room. There's so much there. But on the Cubs front, I opened talking about the starting pitching depth. And let's talk about the bullpen. So last year, the Cubs bullpen going into the season was really, Adbert Alzolay was the closer. I think Julian Merryweather was pretty much lined up to be the number 2 closing option. Yency Almonte was in that mix as well. And then they had signed Hector Neris. And then those combined with Mark Leiter Jr. were going to be the back-end core of that bullpen. Those are the guys you're going to look to in leverage situations. They had Drew Smyly there as a lefty option, more of a probably like a make an emergency start, come in when a starter gets knocked out early, swing guy, that kind of role. And I thought going into last season that the bullpen was solid. I still think with what I knew going into opening day last year, I would still say that was a solid bullpen. The problem was what going into opening day on paper is often, especially with relievers, not what you see once the season started. I don't think Adbert Alzolay was actually ever healthy. We know Julian Merryweather really wasn't. And so your 2 top guns at the back end of that bullpen were flawed from the start. Now, Alzolay really struggled. I think a big part of that was the fact that I don't think he was 100%. But either way, he was awful. They blew a ton of games early. Lots of blown saves. Then Merryweather wasn't around to be the second. Almonte was actually throwing quite well when he got hurt, but then he got hurt. He missed the rest of the season. And so it all fell back to Hector Neris, who really, when the Cubs got him, probably looking at him as for the 6th and 7th inning. The occasional matchup spot with his stuff. And he had closed in the past, so it made some sense that once you got to that point, you would put Hector Neris in. But that was rough. And so you go to this year, and I think the Cubs have learned. So let's take a look at some stats from last year. Let's go to relief pitching. And the Cubs used 30 relief pitchers last year. If we go by innings for usage, Drew Smyly actually led the bullpen with 58 innings, but he took some of those long spots. He came into 50 games. Tyson Miller, the Cubs picked him up in June. He came in 49 games, 50 innings. When you look at a pitching staff, you got to cover roughly 1,450 innings. Technically, 162 games times 9 innings is 1,458. You're not going to pitch 9 innings in every game. You'll have some extra innings. You'll pitch a little bit more. But games that you lose on the road, you're not pitching the 9th. Some games are going to get shortened because of weather, whatever. All those things go into it. But 1,450 innings is what you got to cover. And the Cubs just weren't consistent enough. Some of it was injuries, but they had 12 different guys throw at least 20 innings. They had 7 guys throw 30. The guys who threw 30 innings were Keegan Thompson, Hayden Wisniewski, Mark Leiter Jr., Porter Hodge, Hector Neris, Tyson Miller, Drew Smyly. And when you look at those guys, ideally the Cubs have a healthier bullpen. The top few guys in the pen would hopefully have good seasons, be very reliable, probably start talking more 50-plus appearances, probably looking at 60 to 70 innings for a lot of those guys. The Cubs had part of the reason why Drew Smyly led the team is he was up on the roster all season long. Tyson Miller, they picked him up in June. Hector Neris, they cut him in August. Porter Hodge didn't come up until roughly mid-season. Mark Leiter Jr. got traded at the deadline. Hayden Wesneski was up and down and flipping between starting and relieving. Really starting in the minor leagues. Once he came up, he was straight out of the bullpen. Keegan Thompson was up and down. Jorge Lopez they picked up in June. Ethan Roberts was coming back from injury. Really was only available the second half. They picked up Nate Pearson late. Luke Little came up a little bit after the season started, then got hurt, missed a big chunk of the year. So ideally, you'd want the Cubs to have a really good bullpen. So let's take this and look back to 2021, the year they had David Robertson, Andrew Chafin, and all that. Some of these numbers also get skewed because of the trades, but Ryan Tepera, Andrew Chafin, Craig Kimbrell. Actually, Robertson was 2022. But that year, for getting traded at the deadline, Andrew Chafin had made 43 appearances and 39 in the third innings. Ryan Tepera had made 43 appearances, 43 innings. Craig Kimbrell, 39 appearances, 36 and 2/3 innings. Those guys, had they stayed the full year, if the Cubs had been more competitive, would have been pushing 60 or more appearances, throwing 60, 70 innings. And that's what you want from your top guys, but you still have to have depth. And so we go to 2024. The depth just wasn't there. Yeah, so if you look at the guys who were on the roster to start the season, I'll skip over Tyson Miller and Jorge Lopez because they weren't with the organization to start the season. Yency Almonte didn't throw enough. Alzolay didn't throw enough. You get past Drew Smiley and Hector, and you get rookies, you have Mark Leiter Jr., but then you're really dipping into Hayden Wesneski and Keegan Thompson, Ethan Roberts, Luke Little. But then it's guys you picked up on minor league deals to start the season. So when you look at the way the Cubs are building it this year, right now the way I think the bullpen slots is, for all the talk about competing for the job, Ryan Pressly I think is going to anchor this thing and be the closer to start the season. I think Porter Hodge is going to get chances to close. There's certainly going to be times when Pressly's maybe thrown 3 days in a row. Not feeling great. Just needs to be down for a day. And Porter Hodge, if there's a safe chance, is probably going to get it that day. So you got those two at the back end. Porter Hodge slots in as your 8th inning guy, or there's also the option to use him as your highest leverage guy. If you're a really big spot in a close game in the 6th inning, and you've got bases loaded, you've got one out, and you've got some big hitters coming up, and you decide, I got to get out of this one, maybe you go Porter Hodge right there. So the Cubs will have the ability with Ryan Pressly on the back end to flex Hodge around. He could just be the 8th inning guy and take that, or he could flex into some of these other big leverage spots. Tyson Miller was really good last year. And Tyson Miller, people will look back and say it was just a waiver claim. I remember some of the chatter about him getting DFA'd by Seattle, who got caught in a roster crunch. Tyson Miller has not been a star reliever, certainly. He bounced around a little bit, but really recent past before he came to the Cubs, even last year, he was having a good season with Seattle. He just got caught in the numbers game, and the Cubs were lucky enough to be able to pounce when they saw him. So he's a guy that I think the Cubs can count on to get outs anywhere between the 6th and the 8th inning. Keegan Thompson, he has no options left. So he is either on the opening day roster, or he is DFA'd, traded, whatever, somewhere else. I think Eli Morgan is going to be a reliable bullpen arm this year. If Julian Merryweather can get back to the form he was in 2023, that's high-end stuff. That's another guy like Porter Hodge that you could use in the 8th. He could potentially close a game in a pinch. He could float around to leverage spots and be deployed wherever. So I really like that. Javier Assad has shown he can pitch in just about any role. So right now, I project him, unless he's included in a trade, to be on the bullpen, but he'll be on the opening day roster if he's still a Cub. And Caleb Thielbar has no options. I have him slotted in as the lefty in the pen. So the Cubs have some depth there. And also, of those guys I just mentioned, they are not all going to be nails this year. And we're not going to be able to predict which ones are and which ones aren't. I know there are concerns. There's a lot of, I've seen a little too much chatter about Ryan Pressly is giving me Hector Neris vibes. I get it. He's a guy coming over from Houston who's a little bit older, has had a decline in his fastball velo. It's down a full mile an hour from where it was in 2022 and 2023. But the spin on his breaking stuff is still high level. He still has multiple high level breaking pitches. The problem with Hector Neris was that he had 2 pitches. He had his fastball and he had a split. And he relied on throwing that fastball with command so that then he could play the split off it and get chase. And what he ran into last year is his fastball did not play well. He didn't command it well. And so guys a lot of times weren't chasing the split. But with Presley, he's got a good changeup, or he's got a good curveball. He's got a good slider. He actually has a bit of a changeup he can mix in too. And last year, for whatever reason, if you look at Baseball Savant, look at his StatCast data, his fastball usage was up over the prior years. And that's really, of those pitches, that's his worst pitch. So I'm not sure how or why that wound up happening. Maybe Presley has said since he came over the Cubs that he thinks a lot of his issues last year were mechanical. And he thinks he's about 98% of the way there fixing it. We'll see. Every time there's mechanical issues, there's a chance to wind up breaking something else. But if it's restoring mechanics to where he'd been previously, there's a little less chance of breaking things and less chance of impacting your pitches. But I would expect to see Tyler Zombro and company, Tommy Hotovy, get Presley more back to what he was throwing before. Increase that slider usage, maybe increase the curveball usage, and not ignore the fastball. You can't not throw a fastball. Probably drop that usage a little bit, get more back to the mix he was in before. But there's no telling who's going to have a good year, who's going to have a bad year. And so what you need is depth. You also need depth to cover guys are going to get hurt. Guys are going to struggle. Sometimes you're just going to go through a stretch where you don't have many days off. Maybe there's a rain out and a doubleheader gets thrown in there and you get guys who are just gassed. And so you have to use the Iowa to Des Moines shuttle. And so what they're going to have, what they have right now on in the minors on the 40-man is they have Jordan Wicks, who could be, I think they would still overall prefer him to start, but he could certainly work out of the bullpen. Cody Poteet was a starter with New York last year, but again, is another guy who could be a swing role, work out of the pen. Caleb Killian is on his last option year. I would imagine he'll start the season as a starter in Iowa. But he's a guy who throws 99. He could absolutely get bumped into that bullpen. Luke Little, if he's healthy, he's going to potentially push his way onto that opening day roster. He's certainly capable of it. I know there have been pictures of him throwing down in the complex, so hopefully he's ready to go for relatively normal spring training. Imagine they might start him a little carefully given how much time he missed last year, but if he's healthy and ready and he can look the way he looked right before he went on the injured list last year, that's a dude that's nasty. Then a couple guys who we'll see if they stick on the roster. I think if the Cubs do make some additional moves, whether it's to sign David Robertson, whether it's to trade Robert Suarez or some of those pitchers, 40-man spots have to be cleared. And the Cubs are at the point now where Ethan Roberts and Gavin Hollowell, while they have options left and are cheap, maybe on that next tier of guys to get pushed out. And so that's the pitching depth. And there's also, that's not all the pitching depth. Then you get to Daniel Palencia, has really good stuff. You can see it, but he has not figured it all out. Hopefully this is the year he does. Yeah. Jeremiah Estrada famously struggled with the Cubs to locate, and the Cubs wound up non-tendering him, and now he's electric in San Diego. But we'll see. It was 1 year. We'll see if he's truly been changed and fixed, and that's who Estrada is. And it may well be, because that potential was always in there. Or relievers are volatile. And when we're talking about the innings that I walked through, even a guy who makes 60 appearances and throws 70 innings, that's a month for a starting pitcher. It's still a small sample size. And every single day is its own sample size when you go out to throw one inning. That's why I struggle with using ERA as a real hard measure of how good a guy is anyway. But you can use it. And there are certainly ranges where you want guys to be in. But you look at a reliever's ERA, and it can be so wild. You come out, you're doing okay, you've throwing a couple times a week, you've got an ERA of 3. Good, solid bullpen arm. Probably not the elite closer at that point. You're not the situational guy. All of a sudden, you have an outing where you come into a game where the team's down 1 run. And you can't locate anything. Maybe a bunch of guys in the bullpen are down. Somebody gets you for a 3-run home run. Now you're down 4. It's late in the game. You just have to. You're going to have to just wear that inning. The team is just not going to burn the rest of the bullpen to chase, say, a 4 or 5 run deficit late. So you get to stay in. You continue to struggle. You can give up 3, 4, 5 runs without recording an out, your ERA is trashed for probably months. So when looking at relievers and looking at the ERA, I like to go back to game logs, look back to the monthly splits, things like that, to see like, were they pitching at this level all year, or did they really get blown up in 2 outings? Because you look at Ben Brown last year. He had that one horrific outing when he was first called up, pitched in relief before he made his first start. Just got lit up. And that's because he pitched to a small sample size that significantly impacted his overall numbers. But they also have Jack Neely. They've got Nate Pearson, who I mentioned try getting back to starting. He was very good out of the bullpen last year, throws hard, former top prospect. And then Ben Brown, who he might be the biggest wild card for the Cubs this year. He looked so good last year, both starting and relief. So if the Cubs if he's back to full health, and I think I've read he's been cleared for a normal spring training. So he may be full go. I don't know what kind of innings limit the Cubs would keep him on. So he may not be a guy that, even if he throws really, really well in spring training, they may not have him open the season as a starter. But he's certainly there for starter depth if guys struggle, guys get hurt. He throws hard. He's got that nasty curveball. And he's a guy who could either be a surprise in the rotation and really help anchor things, because the Cubs don't have a bad starting rotation. And same with the bullpen. Justin Steele, if he does what he's done the last couple of years, borderline ace material. The way Shota pitched last year, ace material. Now, I think last year, I don't want to say aberration because I think he is a really good pitcher. I don't know that his numbers are going to wind up looking that good. I would expect probably a little bit of regression from Shota, but still a very good pitcher, like a good, solid, middle of the rotation guy should be his floor. And then you look at Matthew Boyd, former top prospect with the Tigers, very well thought of young pitcher. And we'll see what he can do. If he can stay healthy, he's got the stuff. He looked really good at the end of last season, looked good in the playoffs. And that's a guy who really has some upside, but didn't throw very many innings last year. So again, he falls into that group with Wicks and Brown, Horton, who just didn't pitch enough last season. So some of those guys, you may have to go with some piggyback outings where maybe you're only throwing them out there for 4 and then throwing somebody else by design on top of them. So maybe that's a way to get 6, potentially even 7 starters into the rotation. Maybe you do start Ben Brown, you go follow him with Assad. See if you can get to the 8th inning. They're going to have a lot of options and a lot of guys who could step up. But also with Brown, if they pitch him out of the bullpen, he could wind up competing for the closer. Or he could certainly be high innings leverage. The Cubs have a lot of guys in that bullpen they can deploy, multiple innings at a time. Tyson Miller went multiple innings a couple times. Porter Hodge probably won't do it often, but could. Keegan Thompson, that's his specialty. When he's been at his best, he's been out there eating up 2 or 3 innings, getting the game deeper, maybe getting the game to the closer. Eli Morgan can throw more than 1 inning. Julian Merryweather has done it. They'll probably watch his workload given his long injury history. Javier Assad, if he's in the bullpen, obviously he's a starter. He can work. Caleb Killian, Cody Poteet, all those guys can go multiple innings. So the Cubs are going to have a lot of opportunity to either save wear and tear on their starters or have a quick hook with a starter and get somebody from the bullpen in, because they'll have guys that can pick up that depth. And so when you look up that kind of stuff with a bullpen, you're looking at 1,450 innings, and you're going to, obviously you want as many of those to come from the starting rotation as possible. But you're going to have to pick up what the Cubs throw last year. Look at those splits again. The Cubs bullpen threw 571 in the 3rd innings last year. So you're going to have to eat up, if the Cubs wind up with starters going deeper than they did last year, which is probably not happening. Maybe you can knock that down under 550 if the starting rotation is more of those short starts that lets piggyback guys. Then maybe the bullpen has to pick up closer to 600. But that's what you're looking at for picking up those innings. And so how are you going to get? It's probably not going to be 10 guys throwing 60 each. So we're going to have to build that up. Some of it will be back and forth. There will be guys that we haven't even thought of now that are in camp on a minor league deal, look really good, make it in. Like I said, some guys who are on the team now that look really promising on paper are not going to pan. That happens to every bullpen every season. And that's where the depth comes in. The Cubs right now, in my mind, if healthy, the Cubs have easily 15 guys that I think I would trust to go out there and get some outs. Now, not all of them would I have huge trust for in leverage situations, but not every bullpen scenario is a leverage situation. Sometimes starter gets bombed, gets knocked out after 5, team's down 5-0. The other defense has nothing going, and you just need like 2 guys to close out 5 innings. It's going to be your lower level bullpen guys. Let's rest the leverage guys. Let's get through this, get out of this game. Maybe give ourselves a chance to fight for an offensive comeback. But there are games like that where you're just not going to win. That's baseball. 162 games. As good as the Dodgers are this year, if they are like the greatest team in Major League history, they're going to lose 45 games. The White Sox last year was the worst team I had ever seen in my entire life. Probably somehow still actually underachieved. But they still wound up winning 41 games. And it was, depending on which record you want to look at, you want to count it, basically the worst, certainly the worst modern day regular season in Major League Baseball history. And they won 41 times. So there are going to be games you just have to chalk up and go. But the Cubs have built up some significant depth. There are probably 8 guys. Let's count them. Porter Hodge, Ryan Presley, Eli Morgan, Javier Assad, Caleb Killian, Jack Neely, Luke Little, Nate Pearson, Ben Brown. That's 9 guys, and I could probably throw plenty in there, maybe 9-10 guys who, in the right situation, could all be really good back-end relievers. But they won't all be. So the question is figuring out, picking the right ones, keeping them as healthy as possible so that you have other guys to go to when somebody's struggling. And I'm excited to see what the Cubs do with this depth. And that's where the Cubs are right now. They've built up depth. They haven't added as much overall as I would have hoped to the top end. But brick by brick, they're building this thing up. And that's where they're going to have to get. So we'll see where they can go. Right now, I probably would have them at 88 wins-ish. We'll get more into that as the season gets more complete. That's where we stand. So let's go. Let's get some more. Get better. Get better every day. Keep building this thing up brick by brick. Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share the episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS+. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS+ podcast on the Bleacher Bunch Productions. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!